Thanks to everybody for joining. This is the second GIS panel. We did our first one in June, and that one is available on the task force's YouTube page if anybody missed it. But there were so many topics, and we had such a good discussion the first time that we're doing a second panel today. And I want to thank all of our panelists for being here, as well as all of our attendees for joining us today. Our moderator is Matt Gage, who is the chair of the 911 Advisory Task Force GIS Committee. And Matt, I'm just going to turn it over to you so you can introduce your panelists today and get us started.
Fantastic. We have actually even a little bit more to talk about today, so I'm going to keep the intros a little bit more brief, but as Daryl said, thank you to our panelists for taking the time to attend and prepare for this. If you want more information about them or who they work for, their contact information is in the topic sheet that was attached to the original invite and that Daryl is going to send out an amended version. Sandy Dyer is a public safety expert with Datamark of Michael Baker International. She's been in public safety for over 20 years in various roles. Charles Van Hoos is a GIS sales engineer at Intrado. He's been with Intrado for, I think, at least 10 years, right, Charles? Where you focused on 911 specific web GIS application development, deployment, and support for 911 services. Richard Kelly is Vice President for Geospatial Solutions at 911 Data Master. Richard has 25 years of public and private sector GIS experience, working for a number of leading CPE organizations. Deb Roseboom is with Geocom, where she's a product manager. She is dedicated to helping GIS professionals and 911 agencies understand the importance of GIS in 911 and NG 911 systems. She's been at Geocom for 17 years. Jeff Young is with One Spatial. Currently, he's an account executive there where he manages public safety, DOT, and other state agency relationships throughout the Rocky Mountains. Previously, he's worked at a number of geospatial data and services firms. So with that, I think we'll start with just a very brief review of sort of what we discussed last time. And I think the first thing we talked about was where and how locally sourced GIS data factors into NG 911. And we talked at length about how locally provided, if not sourced, GIS data is critical for that. We talked about the required GIS data that will be needed, and it can be found in the NENA i3 NG 911 GIS data model. One of the data sets that's included in that is authoritative GIS boundaries, which define who will provide the data, GIS data, for a certain area, which may or may not be the same as your PSAP boundary, for example, or your 911 governing body's authoritative boundary. In addition to that, of course, we have those. We will need those PSAP and emergency response agency boundaries with clean topologies, if you will, or also known as edge matching with your neighboring boundaries. We talked about synchronization of your local GIS, MSAG, and ALI data being necessary to NG 911 readiness, but there was significant discussion about how synchronization is kind of a misnomer these days. It's really, the process is more about comparing the data sets you have so that your known valid addresses are covered, so that nothing is dropped out, so to speak. And then we talked about the need to continue maintaining your MSAG ranges today as normal so that your MSAG can keep providing its function of catching or blocking invalid addresses from being allowed into the ALI database. And we need to keep doing that through and probably even past initial transition to GIS-based NG 911 services. Do any of our panelists want to add to that recap? Hearing nothing, I think we'll start today with Charles for the first new question topic. Can address data comparisons and GIS-based MSAGs enable an interim step towards I3 and G911? Could this help us resolve the issue of local 911 authorities and PSAPs not all having their GIS data ready at the same time? For example, if we all flip the switch at the same time.
Yes. Yes is the short answer. Synchronizing your GIS with your MSAG and ALI is a process that can help really any local authority maintain highly accurate call plotting during your transition to the I3 geospatial call routing. So recall, until a true NG911 system is in place, the MSAG will continue to be used for routing 911 calls. Like most aspects of NG911, the move from tabular to GIS data for geospatial call routing will not happen for everyone all at once, like you mentioned. So that transitions will take place kind of in measured steps over time until each agency is confident in the accuracy and completeness of their GIS database, and the relevant carriers are ready to support geospatial call routing. Again, back to the question, it's important to ensure the accuracy and completeness of your MSAG, like most of you are aware today. And you can do that by routinely synchronizing it with your high quality GIS data. So what does this process look like? You can submit data through a spatial interface that will coalesce and validate those required GIS data sets. And then you can actually either perform a DIY type of comparison using a suitable application, or you can have a vendor do that for you. You'd want to investigate any discrepancies that are found during that comparison process, make the necessary corrections to the respective database, whether it's MSAG, ALI, or your GIS layers. Now you can elect to replace your tabular MSAG with a GIS-based MSAG. We like to call that a geo-MSAG. And that would allow for future MSAG changes actually to be driven by your GIS data. So no longer are you maintaining two separate databases, but you can actually just maintain your GIS data like you will be in the end state of I3 geospatial call routing when the MSAG goes away. But until that time, you can elect to have that MSAG be driven by your changes in your GIS data. And as you submit those changes through your spatial interface, the MSAG will reflect those updates. So this can greatly increase your data management efficiency, along with hopefully improving the accuracy of your MSAG, which will continue to be used for emergency call routing until that transition is complete. I'll stop there. Any other panelists want to chime in on that one?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Hearing nothing, I think we'll move on to Richard's question. Second one for the day. Why does and thank you, Charles, why does the NENA I3 standard include a functional element called an MSAG conversion service? This is data.
Right, and I appreciate it, Matt. Please excuse the fact that my neighbors decided to mow their lawn at this exact moment.
No worries.
So if you hear that in the background, my apologies. Within the I3 architecture document that NENA has, that's STA010, and we talked about this last time, the 700 plus page tome that provides all the infrastructure needs for next generation 911 to exist and operate. Within that is something called the MSAG conversion service. It's in section 4.4 of that document. And the MSAG conversion service is there to support a couple different roles, but the primary way to remember it is that when you move forward and transition a public safety answering point or ECC, Emergency Communication Center, either acronym's fine. When you transition one from a legacy analog, type environment to a more, expected IP-based system, commensurate with the i3 architecture guidance, that you'll have to be able to still provide interoperability between the PSAP that is moved into that upgrade scenario and other PSAPs that haven't. So, for example, if you have 2 counties and County A has done the upgrade, they now have their call handling equipment, they're handling IP-based communications or part of an EZNet, and you have County B, which does not. It's still an old analog system, it's very rural. You still have to be able to do transfers of not only the calls, but also the location information between them. To convey that, there has to be a way to convert what would be expected in PSAP A, this next-gen environment, which has a next-gen type format. We've talked about this before, the PID-flow format. It's sort of the alley replacement information, the stream of information. That has to be converted to a compatible legacy format, which we think of today as the alley, about 512 characters, all the fields appropriately split up. To do that, we know that there is some differences between how a location is conveyed in this PID-flow document, which is based on the civic location data exchange format, where you have all these different fields broken out for a name of a street, for example, North Main, South, North Main Drive, South, all these different components. We have to be able to take those broken out fields in that next gen format in the PID-flow and convert that and compress it to a compatible format in an alley, where you may have the prefix broken out, but the name and the type and the post directional all in one field. So the MSAG conversion service is really a translate. Think of it from a GIS perspective as a translate table. If I get a data set that comes in with north is parsed out, the main is parsed out, the street is parsed out, and the south is parsed out, and I need to change it to where I have just a prefix field and the rest of it in a street name field, that has to be performed somewhere. And the MSAG conversion service does that. Now, how we operate that is really contingent on the data we provision it with. And this MCS has to be provisioned with data which reflects the traditional information we talked about and has to reflect the next gen information, which you'll likely be receiving. And it's bidirectional. It's got to do the translate from a next gen environment to a legacy environment and from a legacy environment to a next gen environment. So the data we typically would provision it with can be GIS data or GIS data and traditional, or a combination of them to achieve that. Now, each of the folks on this call may have different ways it's approached, but the 4.4 section in the i3 document stipulates the parameters that as long as you're able to translate PID-flow to MSAG and MSAG to PID-flow, which is the term for the two commands the MCS has to function on, then we're good to go. It'll be placed somewhere within the network, depending on where it's necessary, usually probably near a gateway between the traffic of these two locations, but it performs that service. A couple last things before we move on is that with the MCS, my apologies with the sound, there's got to be some error codes, things did it process properly, did it not? And lastly, when we're doing this, you have to be able to make sure you provision it regularly. With that, I'm going to mute while the lower people go by.
So, Matt, can I do a follow-up question to Richard just on his comment?
Yeah, and then I'd like to speak to Joseph Bankert's question in the chat.
Okay, so Richard, just from a local data support perspective, do you feel that supporting both the legacy and i3 fields within the GIS data, as it is in the GIS data model, would help with that MSAG conversion service? Like, instead of developing two databases, if you just have a complete database with the NINA GIS data model, aren't you kind of really tackling it, MSAG conversion and everything that i3 needs?
No, I agree. And you and I think Deb, many of us who've worked in the data model work group would probably see eye to eye that for a Rosetta Stone, if you will, a single source for data translation, that what was built out, some of those you co-chaired some of these work groups for road center lines, for example, it provides fields, attributes on the road center lines for what it would be next gen fields, the expectation, and literally written in legacy fields. It could perform that. And likewise, the site structure address point layer would do that. But the problem that I've been running into in some discussions is that the way NINA's section 4.4 is written is that it should be acceptable to upload a flat file that's a really simplistic relate. If I get this kind of naming convention, I need to translate it to that. So, Matt, what I would say in answer to both Sandy and the questions that come up, this is new to the industry. My own personal and professional recommendation would be to utilize road serial line and site structure address point data for provisioning the MSAG conversion service. There may be additional fields necessary that are not currently covered by the data model. And by that, I mean, for example, you're going to have in some locations, Wisconsin's great with this, you could have an N6W23001. And the grid, the prefix is actually the N. N is in Nancy, 6, W is in West, and a 2. So dealing with these goofball things, we'll have to split these up and account for them. And according to the letter of the standard, having a flat file kind of related table should be supportable. But as Sandy said, I would think that you could utilize address points and road centerline GIS data more effectively. And one other thing, when this standard was written, people who wrote it did not necessarily have the opportunity to work through it. For example, I said there's 2 commands, PIDFlow to MSAG and MSAG to PIDFlow. Well, if you deliver an MSAG, that's actually a range, a low to high. Your call handling equipment can't do anything with that. So it should have been PIDFlow to alley and alley to PIDFlow. That did not come out in the standards. It was not caught in any of the public reviews, but now it doesn't work. So you actually have to accommodate that in your designs.
Right. So just a personal note, I actually grew up just a couple of miles from Waukesha County where that crazy house numbering started. I understand what you're talking about there, Richard. Charles, I see you nodding your head to this discussion. I wonder if you have additional comments related to sort of how this ties in with your GIS-based MSAG topic, and if you can speak to Joe's questions in the chat.
Yeah, let me take a look at those questions here. Yeah, I think I would just echo Richard's comments here about, and Sandy, having the ability to store both, let's call them formats of your street name components in both the next gen flavor and the legacy flavor, just the different amount of fields within the same data set. We see that as a common practice today. And a lot of applications, I believe, accommodate that type of data management practice. And the only thing I'll say is, yeah, I agree that the specifications didn't quite hit the mark, as Richard was saying, on, the MSAG is a database that's used for validating alley records and for routing 911 calls. But the MSAG is not really like delivered to the PSAP, right? It's the alley record that gets delivered, which will have an address and street name components and everything. So to Joe's question here, yes, the MSAG is still in play in the EZNet if we're still RFAI and doing legacy-based call routing. But and so you have two separate workflows traditionally for that data management. You have MSAG data management and GIS data management. So what I was talking about when I answered the first question of today's discussion was, how do you kind of merge those two data management workflows into a combined kind of source of data management, which is relying solely, I guess, on the GIS layers. Hopefully that answers the question a little bit. If Deb, I see you're on. If anyone else wants to chime in, please do.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another thought to it, which is, and it ties into what Sandy and Richard and Charles were saying, which is that when you have the GIS data model built out as it is to accommodate the 4 legacy fields and the CLDXF and PIDFlow compliant fields in the same feature in the same structure and schema. All of our discussions when we talk about synchronizing your GIS data with your existing MSAG and ALI, you have to think about that from the perspective of synchronizing those to those legacy fields in particular. And the tighter your synchronization to those fields, the easier this MSAG conversion process is going to work, because you're going to have matches. You're going to have successful matches between the MSAG, the ALI records, all of that stuff in order to convert it effectively through the MCS. So when we harp on and on about ALI and MSAG and GIS data synchronization, this is where it comes together, where that synchronization between those databases and your legacy fields in your GIS is so critical, because it does facilitate this whole interim process of the MSAG conversion and what's needed in order to convert from legacy data into NG compliant PIDFlow, which is what is used to then route the call. So there's a reason we talk about it over and over and why it is so important in this overall process, and how now some of these elements like the MCS come into play specifically to interact with the good synchronization work that's been done. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. I think we might have time for just one quick comment. Jeff, are you wanting to say something?
Yeah, just briefly. Good afternoon, everyone. There was a couple references to high quality GIS data. That makes a prerequisite assumption that all GIS systems are of high quality. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the sustainability issues later on. And that really is the rub, particularly since content on both sides of this equation are dynamic and not static. And so there's very much a transactional element, and determining what that maintenance cycle might be. High growth areas are going to be affected differently than, let's say, rural static areas. Thanks, Matt.
You bet. Yeah, high quality and complete, right? Our next
Yeah,
question.
I'll talk a little bit about quality issues as well. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Not at this time.
Our next question is for Deb. Deb, the I3 functional element known as a mapping data service will also rely on locally sourced GIS data, just like the MCS and other features we've talked about before. What does the mapping data service do? Why do we need this as a part of the I3 model?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, because the standard that was released just 1 month ago today, version 3 of the I3 architecture, that STA 010, really puts more detail into what the mapping data service is. Previous to this, in version 2, there was a description of a map database service that was just a short paragraph with not a whole lot of guidance or direction or understanding. But what you have to think about is, looking at these systems, when we talk about NG as a whole, and we talk about building a network of networks and this fabric across the country of all of these interconnected network systems, at the core of all of it is the GIS data. That is the fuel. That's what's being used to validate locations, to geospatially route calls. So you have to think about building that data out to a larger and larger level, beyond a simple county or a region, out to the state level, state to state. So you're really talking about a massive aggregation of that data at the national level. Eventually, the end vision, right, is to have a whole fabric of data across the country, and data that is not necessarily completely a commercially sourced data set, but rather sourced from local authoritative GIS data built by public safety experts and for public safety use. So, I mean, if you want to simplify it, it's like the public safety version of Google Maps or something like that, where you provide a kind of a borderless map, where you have this rich, up-to-date, accurate GIS data that is being built out to the following the standard and being built out to the entire country, so that when you have cases today, everyone hears the stories about calls that get routed to the neighboring PSAP inadvertently. It's a wireless call on a county boundary. It goes to the neighboring PSAP. They may or may not have the data that represents where that caller is actually coming from. And so they can't find that data in their system, and they don't know where they are to even transfer the call, depending on the knowledge of the caller themselves, and are they even able to communicate? So there's a lot of challenges there. So that's been around for a long time, this need to think about beyond your borders of your PSAP and bring in neighboring data. We're talking about doing that at a much grander scale and building that data as part of a next-gen deployment, whether that deployment is still, it could be a local county. More often than not, we see these as regional or statewide deployments. So it's bringing that data together and then publishing it out as a mapping data service, meaning data is available even if an entire PSAP should go down. There's a common operating picture type of map and map display and data sourced from all of the local GIS data authorities in order to provide that backup and that sort of failover in case there's a need for neighboring PSAPs to have to accept that call and send out response to that call. So that's kind of one of the initial vision of it. It was minimally described in version 2. There's a lot more wording around it. It also changed from, like I said, map database service to mapping data service. But there's also still more work to be done because, okay, if you deploy that at the state level, you still have all the borders to think about with the states next door. And what if those states, are they deploying the same thing? Are they also standing up a mapping data service? How are they coming together? Are we in fact all following the same standard? And even when you think about the national level, is there going to be one overall sort of publisher of that mapping data service, or will it be a series of interconnected and state level or deployment by deployment sets of data? So there's more to be fleshed out with this. It definitely has more solid language in the current release of the architecture, but I think I'm going to pick on Richard a little bit, only because I've heard him say that this is one of the things on his list to potentially seek to spin up a work group specifically to address and flesh it out more. So if you're ready, Richard, I'm picking on you.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Richard Kelly, what Deb's talking about, many of us on this panel, Deb, myself, Sandy, the rest of us, typically get involved with a lot of the work groups and co-chair some of these. And we've got a work group that will be dedicated to investigating best practices or recommendations for the mapping data service we're talking about. One of the things we'll investigate, besides what Deb outlined very well, is the possibility that maybe we should consider web map service, web feature service, because the standard stipulates that you must be able to deliver both an extract, a bounded rectangle of an area based on a location. So you have essentially a raster image of a map, a pixelated map, and or you should be able to deliver the data so it can be consumed. So that same bounding area could do an extract of roads and whatever layers are available. But one of the things we would investigate is, would a web feature service, a web map service from dedicated servers that already host data, particularly of a national nature, could that be a source for data that's perpetually renewed and something that wouldn't require additional extraordinary development and maintenance? I'll give you an example. The National Address Database, put out by Department of Transportation in concert working with the Bureau of the Census, that the NAD, again, the National Address Database, is already up and running, provides access to anybody in both web feature service and web map service feeds of the address points. Likewise, if we need data along the lines of hydro or rail, those base things that we all think should be on a map, those things are available as national data sets. So we essentially already have the hard work done where we have all this stuff distributed around the country. Now, as Deb said, we need to talk about rendering and how it's delivered and supportable. These are the kinds of things we'll investigate in that work group that Deb mentioned. And all of us will work collaboratively to come up with what is a reasonable and practical approach. Fingers crossed. I wasn't a fan of the MDS. I was opposed to it. So naturally, I got volunteered to lead the effort on it within NENA. So we'll see what we come up with So anybody who's willing to join in, Charles and everybody else, jump in with us on that. That'll be a fun project.
It's always great to do a shameless plug for NINA workgroup participation on these.
Always. Not
Well,
enough.
and I'm going to volunteer, but from a public safety perspective, because for those of us back in the day, I mean, we have always received calls, 911 calls. My family member in New York is having an emergency, but they're calling me here in Arizona. And the only thing I could do was a quick TQ inquiry of NCIC to see if there was actually anybody I could try to transfer this call to, right?
Yeah.
And the NINA PSAP registry tried to address that concern, but the MAP data service, is that what it's called now? I'm
Mapping
getting
data service, MDS.
Yeah. I'm getting it confused with the old version, so I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I think we could challenge it to be more usable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to put the map data to it, let's actually make it usable by the PSAP and more functional by marrying together those two solutions. So I'll join your working group because I wasn't a fan of it either. But if we can enhance
Right.
the PSAP experience, then that's what we need to do.
Well, I think there's ways of accomplishment, and I'm going to piggyback on the phrase we heard earlier, which is a favorite word. Jeff, you mentioned this, is sustainability. We have to come up with a way to build and manage that's sustainable. I'll be interested to see what Jeffrey's going to talk about on some of the data, but that's the big challenge. How do we provision it? How do we manage it over time? And as Sandy said, my dad had a heart issue that occurred a couple months ago. He lives in a small town called Lago Vista. I live in Cedar Park, outside on the fringe of Austin, Texas. So I'm calling dispatch. Naturally enough, these things only happen at night. At 11 o'clock, I'm trying to tell them where I am. So they're going to naturally have my call that appeared at PD on the console, but I have to describe an area that's out of region where my dad is. So this is a common scenario where if you need that and you don't have access to anything, the PSAP registry, you may not even know what it is in dispatch. But if there's a way to click a button on your console and have a map display of the area that the caller is telling you about, you could have that come up, particularly if you don't have access to Google Maps, right? You have an isolated PSAP center. So the MDS, the Mapping Data Service, can provide that map display or the data for things outside of your region that is going to be probably more probable in a future, again, copying what Deb said, in a network of networks where everything's interconnected to everything else. And that's one of the good things and one of the downside things that we have to be aware. We could get calls from not just in deliberate calls like I just described, but in non-deliberate where you're getting a call. Somehow got, Matt, you're dealing with the county SO and suddenly you get a call from Poughkeepsie. Where the heck's Poughkeepsie? Isn't that one of those eastern places? So,
And how do you spell that?
Yeah.
Well, but Richard, going to back what you're saying is that what they should have been able to do for your call is you should be able to give them your dad's address. They should have been
That's
able
right.
to search it in a map. And that search should have been able to query a PSAP polygon that would have then instituted a forest guide that would have allowed them to transfer
Right.
it directly.
It took us half an hour. I had to go through 3 PSAPs live on the phone. I got to experience my local 911 transfer process.
Right.
So
Sorry,
far beyond the initial concept of your default backup PSAPs having your map data through an MDS to be able to help with your calls when you can't take them, but well beyond that.
Yes.
I think we need to move on. Thank you very much for the discussion. We have a question from Chris McNay in the chat. Has there been a decision or discussion on how that data is going to be delivered yet for Colorado? Chris, the EZNet Users Group, which is a committee of the Colorado 911 Task Force, has just recently begun discussing how to do that. It's a little bit like herding cats because we have 58 separate 911 authorities in the state, and each of those authorities will be responsible for providing or seeing to it that the GIS data is provided on their behalf for these core NG911 services and the MDS and so forth to operate. So we're just beginning that discussion of how to go down that path. To your question or a comment about working with your neighboring PSAPs, I would say absolutely. And I think Jeff's going to talk about this a little bit more later, and I'm sure Sandy will have something to say as well. But definitely be working with your neighboring PSAPs, your neighboring 911 authority boards, But we need to be thinking about not just PSAP boundaries, we need to be thinking about GIS authoritative boundaries. So they may overlap, but the idea is that we try to eliminate the amount of overlapping data that gets uploaded to the spatial interface for the state, right? And so that's where you talk to your neighbors and you say, this is our boundary for which within here, we will provide the necessary GIS data and maybe additional data for the MDS, for example. Moving on, our next question is for Sandy. The FCC is phasing in requirements for floor level information or Z-axis altitude requirement required in alley data for 911 calls. The NG911 GIS data model requires address points to have an elevation attribute as well. What are some recommendations that you might have for development of GIS data to support three-dimensional awareness for 911 calls?
Well, so I'm going to tackle this from a public safety side. Okay. Richard sits on the 3D GIS work group. And as I mentioned in the last time we got together, I'm highly respectful of people that actually sit on those working groups and would like, obviously, Richard to be able to jump to respond more specifically about any GIS requirements. Because I'm not on that working group, I don't want to present any information that is going to be contrary to the guidance that's coming out. What I do want to start with, though, is that, so as of April, 80% of wireless 911 calls are supposed to be within 50 meters, right? So your uncertainty should be within 50 meters for 80% of your 911 calls, meaning your latitude and longitude has a potential search area within 50 meters, right? And to the extent that's capable, and this is highly questionable as well, as what if you attended any of the NINA sessions, I don't know if a lot of folks were there, about dispatchable location, that if some sort of dispatchable location or usable location should be delivered with your 911 calls. Now, having said that, when it comes to Z-axis, what they also shared at NINA was that as of June 2021, major providers have already said, we're not going to be able to meet your Z-axis requirements, right? And they have gone into this consent decree on how to remedy that, but had already stated they're not going to be able to do it. What was part of the consent decree was that they were going to, carriers must deliver available Z-axis location data nationwide to alley databases to which they deliver horizontal location information to the extent that they're doing it. So from a public safety side, really want you to get a hold of your 911 system service providers and your wireless carriers to see how this impacts you, right? Start those discussions, because what you will need as part of this is adjustments to your legacy alley. So while you may be collecting confidence and uncertainty, latitude and longitude today, you have to be able to find space in your 512 characters to also put in your Z-axis, right? So have those discussions, reach out to your wireless carriers, find out what with the consent decrees, because this is with the three major carriers, what that means as far as your market. Talk to your 911 system service providers, find out what kind of changes are happening for your alley, see how it's going to shift your data fields at all. Because, you know, when you're dealing with your alley data stream, a lot of your alley data stream is directly connected to how you're purposing that in your CAD system as well, and see whether or not that's going to have a shift there, right? So from a public safety side. From a programmatic side, as far as the GIS, the first thing I'd like to ask you to do is assess your need, right, from a 3D GIS perspective. And the reason that I say that, coming from my experience, both at a local and at the state level, folks, I know a lot of work is needed just to get NG911 ready data. And that's just the basics of what we know that we need in order for next generation 911 to work. So should we be talking about 3D GIS? Yes, I'm excited that NINA is addressing this aspect of the FCC requirements. And although the FCC cannot direct PSAPs, the guidance that they provide, the 911 PSAP ends up having to take care of, right? Because those calls are being delivered to us because they have to be delivered to us based on those requirements that are put on the carriers. I want Nina talking about that. I want them to build the rules around it. I want them to put the guidance out there ahead of time. What I would like for you is to focus on what you need to do to actually become NG 911 ready. The compliance, the completeness, and the capability that goes with that. And as part of that, I would really, really love to see you start building that sub-addressing information, right? Road center lines and just the address points to a main address level is going to be a heavy enough lift. In order to best support, even from a situational awareness point of view, the Z-axis, you're going to need sub-addressing. So an X, Y, and Z in a wireless call isn't going to have civic location information in it. It's not, but we're going to need that database from a PSAP perspective when that call plots to be able to know once we get there, is that what floor is that really sitting on? X, Y, and Z is great, but when it plots on there, I need that subfloor, I need that floor information to help me from a situational awareness point of view to really navigate my first responders. I don't want a dispatcher looking at a map and starting to count their floors, and we're going to hope that they're counting the floors right because we don't have the right sub-addressing involved. And I wasn't able to sit in Richard's presentation at NINA. I did get the PowerPoint, and Richard, I don't know if you know this, but your video was not part of the packaging that went out because I went to go listen to it and it wasn't there. I was actually in the real-time text session.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was in the real-time text section, which is a different one where the FCC made requirements of the carriers, but the PSAP has to put, you know, new means in place to be able to accept those calls. So I wasn't able to attend his. But they've got they have some really great, if you can at least get the PowerPoint, and Richard, you may want to share it out to the group, right? I don't mean to offer that resource of yours, but it had some really great content as far as what that may look like from an indoor mapping point of view, right? So I guess the moral of my story is I want you thinking about indoor mapping, but I want you thinking about it, and I want you thinking about Z-axis and building all that information after you're actually NG 911 compliant, right? And part of NG 911 compliance is going to be focusing on that sub-addressing level. Richard, do you want to expand on that?
Well, actually, Sandy, I would just want to make a comment. The thing that really stuck out to me for what you've been telling us is you're actually far more in preference of sub-address data that includes floor level information. So that would be part of the dispatchable location as opposed to XY or elevate Z-axis,
right?
As a part of the coordinates. Far more useful from the dispatch end user perspective.
Right. Well, so we have to remember next generation 911 is not just about can I locate the 911 call and can I route the 911 call, but what is the PSAP experience with that 911 call as well? And we want the same GIS data that's navigating our NG 911 network to be sitting in our PSAP. Now, so Z-axis and dispatchable location, so when the FCC talks about Z-axis, they're talking about it from a wireless perspective, but it goes hand in hand with the dispatchable location. So what my suggestion is, or I guess what I'm inferring is that even if a call comes in as wireless, because look, the biggest discussion I get from communities is, I don't know why I need to worry about road center lines and address points when 80% of my calls are wireless in nature and it's a latitude and longitude. At the end of the day, we need road center lines to help us understand what that wireless call means. I need boundaries to understand where that call's at. I need address points to give me, from a dispatch perspective, better information as to what is the situational awareness around that XY coordinate. And that's why I would like, I guess me personally, my recommendation would be focusing on the sub-addressing level, because not only is it going to support everything that you do from a government perspective today, but it's going to prepare you for that 3D GIS when your community is able to afford and assess that you can get there. Now, remember, sub-addressing is subfloor, not just above sea level, but below sea level. And like here in Arizona, we have to worry about the Grand Canyon, right? How are we going to map that when that Z-axis comes in, right? But yeah, I mean, Richard, do you have any thoughts, or Deb, or any of the panelists on that?
Yeah, in brief, I am on that work group, and Brandon and the work group chairs provided that presentation, Nina. If there's interest, Matt, let me know if you'd like to get a copy of that. I can make sure we're cool with giving you a
Yes,
copy of
please.
that, and
Yes.
then you can distribute to those who need it. Following up what Sandy said, one of the things to be aware of in that work group is we are providing a document. I think it sits at about 170 pages now, Sandy, and it's going to cover everything. We kind of reviewed some of the guts of it at the NINA conference, but some of the key factors, is that we went over and talked about how there's 4 different deliveries of Z value. You're going to have it as a civic location, a dispatchable location, a geodetic location, and even a stated location. Somebody's describing where they are. And as she said, to be able to deal with visual vertical context, you have to have some kind of a map or some kind of visualization there, because that's what we're dealing with right now. Eventually, we'll be able to take vertical information and make that a dependency for routing. So if I'm on a bridge, do I get the local sheriff's office because I'm on the bridge, or is it going to be Coast Guard because I'm over part of the bay and they need to get a water surface response? So there's a lot involved in the document. It's going to discuss the differences between altitude, elevation, and height. Altitude is the key word we all need to start using regularly and vigorously, because that's going to be the naming convention we use for what Z actually represents, not elevation and height per se, although you can have your equipment convert to that. And the thing that was mentioned as well was that, dispatchable location is great. We can't introduce dispatchable location into traditional databases today because there's no place for a lot of that information other than additional information field. So we can't get down to the building unit room floor yet in that information. That can be contained in the PID flow. But if you can't enter that data, if you're an MSAG coordinator or a addressing coordinator, you can't enter it in the first place into a structure that can deliver that, it's not going to get delivered. So there are other methods that has to be delivered or ascertained. That's where additional data repositories can come into play. That's where interpretation by software. For example, if I get an altitude of 27 meters, I can convert it to feet, and then I can convert that to what I think floors are at a certain location downtown. You can do some interpretation of that. And all of that, everything I've said, is provided in the context of that document and in the presentation that was discussed. So as Sandy said, I'd recommend folks check it out when you get a chance. And when the document comes out, again, it's going to really be a pace setter for dealing with Z in 911 operations across the country. Please check it out and provide your content. Sorry, Deb, I'm going to put a plug in wherever I can.
Well, and so the reality is why I'm excited that Richard's working group is working on this is because we've always, and anybody who knows me knows that I love Nina, but I'm also sometimes the biggest critic. And part of the criticism, as we've been kind of sometimes behind the messaging, right? It's already rolling out, but then we come out with the standards, or we come out with the guidance. And this is one of those times that Richard and them and others were like, we got to get ahead of this, right? So Matt, when your communities are ready to move in that 3D and build the indoor mapping, and some communities already are across the nation, they're already doing indoor mapping. At least the guidance is already going to be there. So
very good. Very good. Does anybody have desire for one last brief comment on this topic before we move along? Okay, next up is Jeff. Our topic question for Jeff is sort of segueing from this locally sourced data question that we've been hovering about this hour. A number of the functional elements in NG911 depend on locally sourced GIS data, as we've discussed. That data will need to be provisioned, for example, to a statewide EZNet spatial interface, which basically aggregates that data, collates it, does some checks on it to ensure that it'll work for these core functional elements. What are some measures that you think we should consider for a statewide census of our local GIS data readiness? We've talked a little bit about how maybe not all of us will be able to go at the same time or not have our GIS data ready at the same time, but maybe we need to test our data and take a look at where our weaknesses are.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you. So this is in effect a pivot topic in that the underlying theme is, what is the conceptual framework for facilitating geospatial thinking in a public safety environment? That's a very lofty concept, but it really needs to translate into effective value. And it is very much a spatial narrative. I've heard some people say there are no boundaries, and then there's very importance about boundaries, but there is somewhat of a loose coupling of the idea that there's some geospatial competency at the local level that feeds then a public safety component, which has a geospatial competency for other purposes. So there's a loose coupling. And certainly, and I'm a resident of Colorado, so I have a bias to my description. We certainly have seen enough about fires, mudslides, active shooter environments, access control, mass notification. I did hear Ms. Schwartz from Denver present to a mass notification conference, and the scales fell off my eyes when she talked about lions and the challenges there. There are stories all throughout this state about those kind of challenges. Whether, Matt, it's on 550 south of Montrose on the $1 Million Highway, which can be considered a very treacherous place to chemical spills in the North Platte, or activities in and around tunnels. So there very much is a perspective here as I'm a resident of Colorado, but there's also the reality of physics. Interesting, I saw the FAA's most recent rendering of broadband coverage statewide, not necessarily a dependency. Thank goodness we have the P25 radio network, but there are going to be gaps. And what I'm referring to is geo gaps, particularly in rural and remote, maybe that's a better way of saying it, remote Colorado. As an example, San Juan County or some of the other very small, less than one person per square mile populated places. But there are also people who drive through those geographies and are subject to a 911 response. And we need to also appreciate that this is a great opportunity. And forgive me, I'm going to pontificate a bit. This is truly a great opportunity to advance geospatial technologies at the local level and also truly marry the public safety community with the GIS community. In some respects, we're living in what I'll call a fraternal triplet environment. There's reality, there's the public safety fraternal twin, and there's the GIS fraternal twin. And there may never be agreement in content between all three of those, but it's very much a purpose-driven environment. So there's a bit of a long journey, but it's definitely framed by collaboration. There are institutional challenges, and some of those are very basic and fundamental, like the measures you asked for, Matt, are quality measures and understanding error. And there's somewhat of a checklist that we've used in our environment, particularly on the data quality side, of how precise, accurate, complete, comparable, and representative the data sets are to serve their various purposes. And understanding error in terms of factual, positional, and temporal. So it is very much a transactional environment, truly. And then another fundamental, and Sandy, you really somewhat triggered this for me, this whole idea of yes, we can achieve a precise location, possibly, depending on the nature of the sensor or location. We can characterize a location by street, building, but in reality, particularly for certain types of responders, they need to understand the place. And a good example would be an active shooter environment. I've talked to a few SWAT teams over the years who say, you know what we really need is the material of the door to get into the building. That's the most important thing for me. And that may go well beyond what a public safety NG 911 environment might be. So there is a geo gap. The good news is we as a culture have the ability to adapt, so that specific adaptation to impose command. And again, I believe this is a great opportunity for all participating parties, but there is a capacity and a sustainability issue, which Matt, you alluded I might reference, and that is the fact that some of these rural, again, remote counties may not have full capacity in their staff. And so there may be benefit in mirroring what are emergency response geographies today, where there's a collaboration or a consortia of counties so that they can build up capacity across those boundless county boundaries. And do it in a product agnostic way so that the ESINet, if I'm using the acronym correctly, can be a successful crucible for this content and refreshed very much so. I think it was Richard, you had mentioned Rosetta Stone. That was in my notes that, yeah, there's definitely a Rosetta Stone to translate from GIS language to public safety 911 language. And again, on that data quality side, there's certainly the concerns on precision, accuracy, et cetera, but there's also governance. And can it be sustained in a small mineral county? Do they have the capacity to provide a contribution regionally and then upflow from there, and workflows? And the reality is broadband will not be a coverage area. One comment I'll make, in the customer sets that we've worked with, which Sandy now includes Arizona, incidentally, so feel safe. But the idea of multi-agency at the state level cooperation, state lands, in the case of Arizona, I'll use that as an illustration, the DOT and the 911 authority out of the Department of Administration. That analogous model, and I know, Matt, you're working towards that, and others, will certainly pay dividends for the state. So I would like to say we have a challenge with this geo gap, but it can be overcome. Collaboration, coordination, consortia, ideas. It is a worthy aspiration to achieve this over time. And I'll say there are some what I'll call ghost technologies out there. For those who are in the geospatial area, you might hear the word BIM is becoming much more popular. Well, in reality, it's a built environment model, not necessarily struck to a single standing structure, but also a campus. And a lot of those unique problems related to sub-addressing come in a campus-like setting. Special populations need to evacuate, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of variation geographically, spatially. So it is a heterogeneous model. And many times when I look at the 64 counties of Colorado, is that a wise unit of analysis? Is there some other unit of analysis to understand capacity? It happens to be a convenient geographic boundary, but when you have 64 counties and most are under a population of 50,000 in the state, that suggests that there might be some capacity issues. And kind of in conclusion, I'd like to suggest that there are some professional guilds out there that might help us get over that implementation barrier. And one group that I spent a weekend with last weekend is GIS Colorado. Their membership, of which, Matt, you're a member, is predominantly state and primarily local government operators who behave like a guild, that have a great deal of knowledge and can contribute to this if we reach across the hallway, so to speak, or the next building down, because there's a lot of thought leadership there. And certainly NACO is another group that, although maybe not be tied in so tightly to NENA, have been looking at the supporting infrastructure like broadband, and just recently in February came out with a characterization nationwide. So our challenge, build and maintain and sustain capacity, share and collaborate, and get to a posture of readiness. Thank you very much. Hopefully that gives some food for thought.
I think a key point to come out of that is we don't just need to build our relationships. between the 911 authorities, PSAPs, and the local GIS departments, if you will. But we also need to foster, if they're not already there, relationships among the neighboring GIS departments because of those GIS authoritative boundary issues. And altogether, your idea of maybe opportunities for rural 911 authorities and their GIS partners to collaborate for cost effectiveness on providing the data that they'll be responsible for to upload to the ESINet. Charles, did you have a quick comment that you wanted to add to this?
Sure, yeah. And I think just to sum up, and there were a couple questions on this call today from Joe and Chris, kind of about this topic. So the chosen system will help you progress the quality of your data. It does that by validating your data in concert with your neighbors. Again, because the spatial interface is responsible for coalescing data and, again, validating that data with, the neighboring jurisdictions that are also submitting data to the spatial interface. So the SI is the gateway, the GIS data gateway, let's say, for all the systems that are used to support NG911, so to support the ESINet. Your data will be checked for quality issues, reporting those errors back to you, enabling you to really take control of your data management workflow. What I mean by that is you'll get real metrics to report on your data readiness. That's all I got.
Very good.
Hey, one other point, Matt, if I can insert quickly. Apologize.
Sure. Yeah.
State of Virginia and state of Minnesota, and I'm sure there are other states, have actually built a template for measuring readiness at the county level. And I just reviewed both of those this morning, and there's a discrete measure on readiness, which includes.
Jeff, we lost your audio. Jeff, are you able to hear us?
I apologize. I hit too many buttons there.
No worries.
Fat finger operator. But what I was going to say was there's some exciting templates out there to measure readiness at the county level. Colorado may be approaching this. I'm not aware of that. But certainly in the case of Minnesota, it includes things like basic street name validation, address validation, community name, readiness, ESN validation, et cetera. And then there's a dashboard that shows where things are at a statewide level organized by county. Since Colorado has 64 counties, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneous representation on where people are as they move forward. Thank you.
I think we'll move on to our last topic. We left this up for grabs for our panelists. So I think I'll just state the question and see who jumps first. The question is, what are some recommendations for building relationships between GIS and 911 staff for these perpetual data updates that we're going to need? This isn't a one and done thing, right? It's as things change in our geospatial data, we'll need to regularly provide those updates for the core services to operate. But we're also going to have 911 discrepancy reports for the GIS data, right? Today in Colorado, we have them for alley data from 911 calls and perhaps other sources, but it's been mentioned a couple of times that we'll have GIS data discrepancy reports to resolve as well in concert with our GIS partners. So who'd like to go first? Okay, Charles, have at it.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think this is a great topic because we're talking about a more holistic approach to your data management. And what I mean by that is really we all want to make it easy for everyone involved, whether it's the call takers and dispatchers of the PSAP to your back office GIS staff. Make it easier for them to report discrepancies that occur in your organization. If you're able to do that, that'll really, you'll be able to reap a lot of benefits in the long-term success of having your GIS data support your 911 operations, because you have that communication, let's say, between the end users and the folks managing the data. So you can do this, you can accomplish this with like a purpose-built application at the PSAP that integrates with your GIS data management solution. Again, allowing that open communication between the PSAP and your GIS staff on how well the data represents the real world. You can derive monthly metrics to evaluate how many of those discrepancies are found, how many are resolved, and what methods were used. And the last thing I'll say is that while it's never really not very fun, but documenting this process will really help your organization continue to progress, because those workflows, will change over time, and it's important that if there is personnel turnover or unavailability for any reason, that you can continue those procedures uninterrupted.
You're on mute, Matt.
Well, thank you, Daryl. We have a lot of construction going on outside for a new police department building, and trying to keep that out. Just like today, we try not to let alley discrepancy issues run for too long. We try to get them resolved very quickly, and with continuity as staff changes, keep that process up for the GIS data discrepancies as well. Does anyone else have input on this topic?
This is Deb. I guess I'll just say that anytime that you can foster collaboration between your GIS staff and your 911 staff, whether it's from the very beginning as far as trying to centralize your addressing efforts and just bringing that together into a collaboration with public safety, local governments, GIS, you're always going to benefit from that. And the winners in all of that are going to be the 911 callers that have reduced response times and less confusion over, where to send those responders when you're calling for help. So I would just say, if there hasn't been an established, maybe you work for an agency that has a dedicated GIS staff person, and that's fantastic. A lot of times, though, it may be supported from your local government, whether it's a dedicated GIS department or a GIS person within one of several departments. But figure out who that person is and really foster an ongoing, regular meeting, even just standing up a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly meeting, whatever frequency works, and making sure that you have that set and you're communicating so that as all of this comes together, everyone is on the same page and in lockstep, whether that's to support existing systems today and any preparation efforts that you're doing for a next-gen deployment.
Yeah, just if I can append a comment to that, this whole idea of addressing goes far beyond a 911 implementation, obviously, whether it's building code enforcement, fire inspection, just land management purposes, taxation assessment. And it was Pete McGee in the Valley, San Luis Valley, who said to me, "Gee, Jeff, it's all about addressing," even though the mobile component is obviously significant. And I think Sandy edified that as well. It puts things into context. So there's still a framework, although the calls may be 80% from mobile, where addressing in all of its form and land management in all its form have value. Thank you.
Matt, this is Richard. If I could add a comment, follow up on what the previous everybody said so far. One of the things that I've seen, I've been doing this public safety now and worked for about 25 years now, and coming from government and having to work with local governments and having, teaching groups and coordination groups with the cities and the counties and the region and the other councils of governments, collaborations across the state and between states and federal agencies. One thing I've come to see that is growing out of all of this is that we're going to have to find a way eventually, whether we want to or not, to have data that is perpetually renewable. That is, there's a mechanism by which, as data is built or updated or fixed at the local level, that it propagates, it flows upward to larger organizations that can utilize that for the greater good and other needs. That happens already in the private sector. If anybody's used Google Maps or any of the other larger databases, whether you know it or not, when you're searching for something on a commercial site, you're going to have that data being accessed. However, if we can work towards a common goal that local governments who have the mandate to build and manage that data, or their proxies, sometimes they enlist commercial entities to do that, that as that data, being taxpayer funded in most cases, propagates and moves up from the city to the county, or the county to the state, and the state to the national level, that we might be able to see a potential where that data has a degree of consistency as it follows standardized parameters by which data is built. Sandy mentioned the data model, and Deb as well, and those folks are on these groups for stewardship and how data should be built. So I would like to see someday myself to where there's an understanding throughout government levels that we're building data for our local mandates based on taxpayer funding, right? And that data needs to be pushed to others, not in fear that, I hope they don't find my mistakes, but please tell me if something's wrong so we can fix it, because of the necessity to use that data in a sustainable way for public safety. Full stop. That has to be an understanding. It's not for profit. Just Data's never really for that from the government side. But if we can get to that point, everything we've discussed today is going to be necessary, particularly as we have the paradigm change, full paradigm change from a commercial interest tabular database run by private sector telephone company interests, as we transition to something that's built and managed by the public sector, local governments, with whatever resources they have, whatever staff they have, and we know that's subject to change on a regular basis across the country. Consistency of standards, consistency of management, and consistency of goal can, in the end, in my opinion, provide that dependence that we're going to need, and definitely the sustainability, I use that word over and over, sustainability of data provisioning throughout the country. I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, and Richard, actually, I've had a different paradigm shift. So I've been thinking a lot about what is the struggle of the GIS and public safety relationship in NG 911. So 911 is an exercise in trust. The 911 caller trusts that the PSAP can be able to locate them. The public trusts that we're going to answer their call and we're going to locate you and we're going to send help. And the 911 authority trusts the GIS data providers, providing them good information to help them be successful in that trust relationship with the public. And the GIS data providers relying on the addressing authorities and their local data providers and anyone else that they interact with, that they're doing high quality work and they're doing the work that needs to be done in order to, when they take the data and they aggregate it and they share it with 911, that this exercise in trust is going all the way down to the local level. And when I was thinking about it as an exercise of trust, I thought, why are we having trouble with this conversation between public safety and GIS? Why does it seem like the conversation happens in public safety or it happens in GIS, but it's not happening collectively? Then I remembered that even for me, when I was a dispatcher, 12 years dispatching, I didn't know how a 911 call worked. I just know it magically showed up, and I had everything that happened, right? I didn't know what an MSAG was. I didn't know about all that functioning of 911 until I became an MSAG coordinator. And still today, when I go across the nation and I do workshops, I'm trying to build these relationships, most of the time inside coordinators come up to me and say, thank you so much for talking about my job, because nobody knows that I'm out there or what I do. Because even in Arizona, with 85 PSAPs, we have 15 MSAG coordinators. We have how many dispatchers, but only 15 MSAG coordinators. So how much do you really think they know about each other? And if from a public safety level, we've gone since 1968 with not really understanding the databases and how it worked, when we answered that beautiful 911 call and all this stuff just worked for me, whether I thought it worked right or not, it worked. How do we get those same people to now understand GIS, and that they need GIS and they need that relationship, and that our exercise and trust with our GIS data providers now took us from us, fire, law, and EMS, to us, GIS, permitting, public works, addressing authorities. You think of every touch point you have in government, that's the information we need to exercise that level of trust with our caller. And that's where I think we're running into the problem. I think the problem is we, from a public safety point of view, it just magically showed up. We didn't understand how it got there. So now we have GIS professionals going, I'm here to help, I'm here to help. And you have public safety people going, okay, well, our transactional relationship is I need an update to my map, so I'm going to call you when I need an update, and not understanding the bigger picture. So I think that, so like efforts that Colorado's doing, and many states are doing this, I don't mean to sound like I'm all doom and gloom. There are a lot of people that are trying to bridge that conversation. Well, I guess what I want to offer to you is, if after 30 years, my first day in dispatch was April 1990, right? So after 30 years, if it's finally dawning on me that the disconnect between these two industries is because one didn't realize how much we needed the other, even though that MSAC coordinator sat in our same building as us. Can you imagine how much we don't realize how much we need you, and you're in a different building doing something we don't understand? So
symbiotic dependency.
Right.
Very much
right.
so.
Let's call it the global consciousness, right? The 911 global consciousness now brings in a larger family. I think that was the paradigm shift I went into recently. And so I'm hoping anyone who's on this call will start to deliver that message of understanding that it's not that they don't want to work with you. They don't understand what it means to work with you. And maybe through better education efforts, we can find a way to really push NG91 along. I want you to be excited about NG91. I want you to realize that what you're going to do is help people to stop dying because we don't know where you're at, right? We can't help you. I'll get off of my soapbox at this point, but I think we talk so much about data and data supply chains and how are we going to make this happen, and we're forgetting about the relationship aspect in itself. And that needs, I think, a little bit more attention from both industries as a whole.
You're muted, Matt, you're muted.
Again. Thank you. Sometimes from the 911 side, it feels like we too need to evoke the passion that, when you get into the 911 business, you get fired up and you get really passionate about it, especially at the local level. And how can we evoke that in our GIS partners or other folks that we need to partner with to provide that data? So does anyone else?
Yeah, Matt, if I can insert one comment, and it's sort of, there's a cadence problem here. 911 is every day, perpetual, 7/24. And being a GIS professional historically, you have a different delivery pace. You have a different expectation of collect, analyze, validate, maintain. Maybe you do a report once a week, once a month. And so that cadence variance needs to be resolved in some fashion. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've exhausted this topic, but I'll leave opportunity for one last short comment, and then we'll take any questions if we have any from the audience. Hearing nothing, I would like to ask if our attendees have questions. Okay, I think we've covered everything well enough for today. Daryl, would you like to close this out?
Sure. I just want to say thank you again to all of our panelists and to the attendees who joined today. I think, again, we had a terrific discussion. This meeting will be put up on the task force's YouTube page, probably within a couple of days, but I want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope that you are able to join us again in the future for additional lunch and learns that we will be having in our off months. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good day.
That's great. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.